Welcome to The Explainer. Today we're digging into a really fascinating argument that traces our modern political division all the way back to a single moment, the very first domino in a chain that's been falling for more than half a century.
So yeah, how did we get here? The source we're looking at today says it wasn't just one thing, but a whole chain reaction. And it was all kicked off by one of the most controversial elections in American history, way back in 1968. All right, let's talk about that first domino, the 1968 presidential election. The lecture we're pulling from really zeroes in on this moment as the point where a new, much more cynical style of politics started to take hold in America. What's pretty wild is just how fast everything turned on a dime. So picture this. It's the final days of the campaign. President Johnson gets on TV and announces this huge breakthrough in the Vietnam peace talks. The war looks like it's finally ending, and boom, the Democratic candidate, Hubert Humphrey, just soars in the polls. But then, literally days before the election, the whole thing collapses. South Vietnam just walks away, and Nixon ends up winning by a razor-thin margin. So, why did the talks suddenly fall apart? Well, the source points to this absolutely stunning quote from President Johnson himself. He was caught on a recorded phone call accusing Nixon's campaign of secretly going behind his back, telling South Vietnam to sabotage the peace talks in exchange for a better deal later. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. The sitting president of the United States believed his successor had committed treason to win an election. And this win-at-all-costs mentality, it wasn't just stuck in Washington, D.C. According to the source, that same attitude started to bleed over into the business world, and it completely changed the face of corporate America.
Before the 1980s, the general idea was that big companies had a responsibility to their communities, to their workers, to the towns they were in, but that all changed. This new philosophy popped up that said a company's only job was to make as much money as possible for its shareholders. The lecture we're looking at points to GE's famous CEO Jack Welch as being one of the biggest champions of this new kind of ruthless approach.
And this chart, wow, it shows you exactly what that looked like in the real world. When Welch became CEO of GE in '81, around 55% of the company's profits went to shareholders. 20 years later, that number had skyrocketed to 88%. This huge shift of money away from things like community investment and straight into the pockets of investors, that was a key part of what they called Reaganomics.
So, what's next? The source argues that this same cynical, bottom-line mentality was then applied to social policy here at home, and the consequences were, well, pretty devastating.
Just look at this number for a second. When Ronald Reagan took office, only 0.3% of adult men in the country were in prison. It's a tiny, tiny fraction.
Okay, now look at this. Just 4 years later, after he launched his war on drugs, that number exploded to 3%. That is a 10-fold increase. The source makes this really chilling point, that this rate of incarceration was actually comparable to the Soviet Union during Stalin's purges.
And of course, this policy didn't affect everybody equally. Not even close. As this chart makes pretty clear, the weight of it fell disproportionately on minority communities. At this point, 8% of the entire adult black male population was incarcerated. Compare that to just 2.5% of white men.
And the trend didn't even stop there. The lecture argues that President Clinton actually kicked off a second wave of the war on drugs in the late 90s. But here's what the source says makes this move so cynical. It happened after crime rates had already dropped off a cliff. The suggestion is that it was a political move to look tough on crime, not a policy based on what was actually happening.
So you can see how each of these dominoes, Nixon's election, the new corporate culture, the war on drugs, it's like each one added another layer of cynicism, just slowly eating away at the public's trust in our institutions. The source really sees this as a pileup. First, you have the trauma of the assassinations in the 60s, then the betrayal of Watergate, then you get the bitter partisan fight over the Clinton impeachment, and the lecture suggests that for a lot of people, that whole episode felt less like a serious constitutional crisis and more like a political game, which just made that cynical divide even deeper.
And all of this, the lecture claims, was basically setting the stage for the absolute chaos of the 2000 presidential election, a moment that would take all these threads of distrust and cynicism and crank them up to 11. I mean, that election night was just something else. The TV networks called the critical state of Florida for Al Gore, and then they took it back. The vote margin came down to just a few hundred votes. Florida's Supreme Court ordered a recount, but then the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in with a very narrow 5-4 decision to stop the recount, which effectively decided the entire presidency. And here is the absolute crucial point. Al Gore won the national popular vote by more than 500,000 votes. But for the first time in over 100 years, the person who got the most votes from the American people did not become president. For a lot of folks, this was the final proof that the system was fundamentally broken.
So from an alleged act of treason in 1968, to a corporate culture obsessed with profit, to a social policy used as a weapon, and finally to an election decided by the courts, the source lays out a really powerful case for how we got to where we are today. It's a chain reaction, where each fallen domino made it easier for the next one to topple, leaving us with one big, unsettling question. What domino is going to fall next?